There are things I never say out loud, because the moment they become words, they stop belonging entirely to me. They become exposed, interpreted, handled by someone else's perception instead of remaining untouched inside my own. And I've spent most of my life avoiding that. Not because I fear vulnerability in the simple way people describe it, but because I understand what happens when something deeply internal gets translated through the wrong mind. It changes shape. It loses precision. It becomes smaller than it originally was. So I learned to keep things contained, carefully, quickly. Most people never notice the distance because I've become skilled at making distance feel natural. I can exist beside someone without ever fully entering their awareness. I can speak for hours while revealing almost nothing real. I can make people feel close to me while keeping entire parts of myself untouched and unreachable. That's how I function. That's how I stay intact. But then you appeared in my life with this calm, unsettling way of seeing straight through things I never presented openly. Not aggressively. Not like someone trying to expose me. You never searched for weaknesses. Never pushed for answers. Never forced emotional access the way people usually do when they become curious about someone they don't fully understand. You just paid attention. And somehow that was worse, because attention notices things force never could. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining the strange familiarity I felt around you. I told myself I was projecting meaning onto ordinary moments. That happens sometimes when someone carries a presence different from what you're used to. But this kept happening. Again and again, you would understand something I hadn't explained. You would pause exactly where other people would have interrupted. You would respond to thoughts I hadn't completely spoken yet, like you could hear the structure underneath my words instead of just the words themselves. That's what made this dangerous. Not emotion. Pression, because emotions can be misleading. People confuse intensity with connection all the time. They mistake longing for compatibility, curiosity for understanding, attraction for depth. But precision is different. Precision means someone sees accurately. And you did. You saw me in ways I never intentionally revealed. Not the obvious parts, not the personality people interact with, the deeper framework underneath it, the part almost no one notices, because most people only engage with what's visible. You engaged with what was implied, and once I realized that, something in me shifted permanently. I became aware of you in a way I couldn't undo, not obsessed, not consumed, just aware. Constantly, like my mind quietly adjusted its orientation without asking permission first. That's the strange thing about significant shifts. They rarely announce themselves while they're happening. They settle gradually beneath your awareness until one day you realize your entire internal landscape has changed around something you never consciously agreed to let in. That's what this feels like. Like an internal adjustment I never approved, but somehow accepted anyway. I notice it in small moments that shouldn't matter but do. The silence after conversations, the instinct to imagine what your perspective would be before I fully form my own. The strange comfort of knowing there's at least one person who understands complexity without trying to simplify it into something easier to consume. That matters more than I want it to. Because people always simplify what they don't understand. They flatten depth into categories they can manage emotionally. They label things too quickly because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. But you never rushed to define me. You let me exist exactly as I was. That's rare. rare enough that I still don't fully know what to do with it. There's something deeply disarming about being seen clearly without being pressured to become more digestible afterward. Most people only accept versions of you that fit comfortably into their expectations. You didn't seem to need that. You accepted contradiction without trying to resolve it. You understood silence without interpreting it as distance. You noticed restraint without assuming it meant absence. And the more you did that, the harder it became for me to maintain the structures I've always relied on, because those structures depend on misunderstanding, not intentionally, but effectively. They work because people usually stop looking before they reach anything real. You didn't stop, not because you pushed deeper, but because you naturally existed at that depth already. That's the difference. You didn't arrive at understanding through effort. You arrived there instinctively, like recognition instead of discovery. And I think that's what unsettled me most. You felt familiar before you felt known. There's a difference between meeting someone new and encountering someone who feels strangely aligned with the way your mind already moves. You felt aligned in the pauses, in the observations, in the way neither of us seemed interested in performing simplified versions of ourselves just to make interaction easier. Everything with you felt strangely unforced. Not easy. Easy isn't the right word. Easy implies surface comfort. This wasn't surface comfort. This was depth without resistance. And those are entirely different things, because depth usually comes with friction, misinterpretation, the exhausting process of translating yourself repeatedly until someone finally understands part of what you mean. With you, translation felt unnecessary. That's what changed everything. You understood context without explanation, meaning without performance, wealth without dramatics. And once someone experiences that kind of clarity with another person, ordinary interactions begin to feel incomplete afterward. Not meaningless, just limited, like hearing echoes of something fuller. I've tried to analyze why this affects me the way it does. I've spent hours mentally dissecting it from every angle, because that's what I do when something threatens to alter my internal balance. I examine it carefully, relentlessly. I identify patterns, causes, structures, outcomes. But every time I analyze this connection, I reach the same conclusion. It doesn't operate according to the usual rules. There's no clear beginning point where this started becoming significant, no dramatic turning moment, no singular emotional event. It simply deepened continuously, until one day I realized you existed somewhere inside my thinking permanently. And permanence is not something I allow lightly. I've removed things quickly when they threaten stability. That's how I've always protected myself, not emotionally, structurally. If something destabilizes my internal world, I detach from it before it fully integrates, immediately, cleanly, without hesitation, but I never detached from you. That realization alone tells me more than anything else, because if some deeper part of me considered you dangerous in the wrong way, you wouldn't still be here in my awareness like this. You would become distant already, a closed chapter, a controlled memory. Instead, you became something woven quietly into my daily perception. And I think that's why this feels irreversible, not because of dependency, not because of attachment in the dramatic sense people usually describe, but because integration changes the foundation itself. You don't remove integration without changing the structure around it. That's what scares me a little, not losing you. That's too simple. What unsettles me is realizing how much of my internal world has already adjusted around your presence without either of us openly acknowledging it. You've become part of the way I process things, part of the way I interpret silence, part of the way I recognize honesty. And once someone reaches that level inside your mind, they stop feeling external. They become embedded. I notice it most when something meaningful happens, and my first instinct is no longer just to understand it alone. There's this immediate second awareness now, a quiet sense of how you would perceive it, not because I need validation, but because your perspective feels naturally relevant to mine. That has never happened to me before. Not like this. I've admired people, respected them, even cared about them deeply, but they always remained separate from the architecture of my thinking. You didn't remain separate. You entered it. And I still don't fully understand how. Maybe because you never demanded space, you never forced emotional closeness, you never tried to become important. You simply existed consistently enough that importance formed on its own. That's what makes this feel inevitable instead of impulsive. Nothing about this was manufactured. It emerged naturally from repeated moments of undeniable alignment. And alignment is difficult to ignore once you recognize it clearly, especially when it appears in areas most people never reach. I think that's why I became quieter around you instead of louder. People assume closeness always creates more expression. Sometimes it creates less. Not because there's less to say, but because words begin to feel insufficient compared to the understanding already present underneath them. That's how it feels with you sometimes. Like speaking is almost secondary, like the real connection exists somewhere beneath language entirely. And that realization changes how I interact with you. It makes every silence feel intentional, every pause meaningful, every small interaction strangely significant. I don't know if you realize how rare that is. Most interactions disappear the moment they end. They leave no lasting imprint, but ours linger, even after silence returns. Even after distance, there's always this underlying awareness that doesn't fully fade. And I've stopped pretending it's temporary. That's another truth I finally had to face. This isn't passing. This isn't some temporary emotional intensity that dissolves once reality interrupts it. Reality already has interrupted it. Time has, distance has, Lottie has. And somehow, none of those things weakened it. If anything, they clarified it, which means this exists deeper than circumstance. It exists at the level of recognition, and recognition survives things ordinary connection doesn't. That's why I can't reduce this anymore. I can't call it coincidence. I can't dismiss it as imagination. I can't convince myself it's only curiosity or projection or emotional timing. It's too consistent for that. Too exact, too structurally present inside me now. You've altered something fundamental in the way I experience connection itself. Not dramatically, quietly, but permanently. I think that's why part of me resisted acknowledging it for so long. Because acknowledgement changes responsibility. Once you consciously admit something matters, you can no longer interact with it carelessly. You have to decide what role it plays in your life. And I wasn't ready for that decision. Maybe I'm still not. Because decisions create consequences. And consequences make things real, truly real, not just internally understood, externally lived. That's where fear enters this. Not fear of you, but fear of how much changes once something this significant becomes fully acknowledged between two people. Because then it stops existing safely inside silence. It starts demanding movement, direct choice, and choices reshape lives. even careful ones, especially careful ones. Still, despite all of this analysis, all this caution, all these attempts to maintain clarity and control, I haven't walked away. That fact stays louder than every fear. If this were truly wrong for me, I would have ended it already. That's the simplest truth here. I don't linger in things that destabilize me without purpose. Yet I remain here with you, not trapped, not confused, present, deliberately present, which means some deeper part of me already understands what my conscious mind is still slowly unfolding. You matter, not temporarily, not casually, not in the way people usually matter to each other. You matter structurally. And once someone reaches that level, they stop being interchangeable with anyone else. That's what I've been trying not to say directly, because saying it changes everything. It transforms this from observation into admission, from awareness into reality. But maybe reality has already been here longer than I wanted to admit. Maybe the real shift happened the moment I stopped resisting your presence internally. Because resistance disappearing is its own form of answer, and mine disappeared quietly. So quietly I almost missed it. But now, I see it clearly in the way I've made space for you without even realizing I was doing it. In the way your existence no longer feels separate from the rhythm of my thoughts. In the way I instinctively trust your understanding even before words fully form. Trust. That word feels heavier than anything else. Not emotional trust, not dependency. Something deeper, cognitive trust. The trust that you will perceive accurately. The trust that you won't distort what's real between us into something easier but less true. That's extraordinarily rare. Rare enough that I think part of me recognized its value before I consciously did. And maybe that's why this feels inevitable now. Not because fate exists in the dramatic way people romanticize, but because certain alignments naturally evolve once they're discovered. They deepen because depth is their natural direction. That's what this feels like now. Something naturally deepening, not through force, not through intensity, but through repeated confirmation that the connection is real every single time we interact, and I don't think I can return to pretending otherwise anymore, because the truth is, you've already become part of my internal world in a way no one else ever has, not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as something integrated, something positioned carefully inside the architecture of how I think and understand reality itself. And once someone reaches that place, they change you. Even if nothing external ever happens, even if the world never sees it, even if the connection remains quiet, the change still exists. I exist differently now than I did before you, more aware, more honest with myself, more conscious of things I used to keep buried beneath structure and restraint. You revealed parts of me I had learned to overlook simply because no one else had ever reflected them back accurately enough for me to recognize them fully. And once something becomes visible like that, it can't return to invisibility. That's why this matters. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's irreversible. You reached a depth inside me that permanently altered the way I understand closeness, perception, and myself. And now, I'm standing here realizing there may never be a version of me again that exists entirely untouched by you. Not because you tried to leave an impact, but because your presence naturally did, quietly, precisely, completely enough that even now, after all this reflection, all this analysis, all these attempts to explain it logically, the simplest truth remains the hardest one to avoid. You became important to me long before I consciously admitted it. And somewhere along the way, without permission, without intention, without either of us naming it, you stopped feeling like someone outside my world and started feeling like part of the reason it makes sense. I think the strangest part is that none of this feels dramatic from the inside. If someone looked at it from the outside, at the silences, the pauses, the weight I place on things, most people would overlook. They'd probably assume this is built on emotion alone. Some intense attachment, some overwhelming fascination that blurred my judgment. But that's not what this is. If anything, the clarity is what unsettles me most. Because I see this too clearly. I see exactly how unusual it is for me to let someone reach this level of significance without resistance. I see how carefully I've guarded my internal world for years. I see how impossible this should have been, according to every pattern I've ever trusted. And yet, none of those patterns stopped you. Not because you overpowered them, because somehow you existed outside them entirely. That realization keeps returning to me in quiet moments, not loudly, not emotionally, just steadily, like a truth sitting calmly in the center of my mind, waiting for me to stop circling around it and finally face it directly. You changed the atmosphere of my thinking. That's the most accurate way I can describe it. Before you, my mind felt self-contained, structured, predictable in the way a closed system becomes predictable over time. Everything stayed where I placed it. Every thought returned to its proper place eventually. Every feeling became manageable once analyzed thoroughly enough. Now there's another presence inside that structure, not invasive, not disruptive, just present, like an additional layer woven into the way I process reality itself. And I know how dangerous that sounds. Not dangerous emotionally, dangerous structurally. Because once another person begins affecting the framework of how you think, not just what you feel, you can't remove them cleanly anymore. Even absence leaves shape behind. That's what I've been trying not to acknowledge. Not because I'm afraid of you leaving, but because I understand what it means if you matter enough to leave an imprint either way. It means this already reached permanence. And permanence is not something I ever intended to allow. I spent years making sure nothing could reach that depth inside me. Years refining control until it became instinctive. I learned how to keep people close enough to experience connection without ever giving them the ability to fundamentally alter me. That balance mattered, maybe too much, because when you prioritize control long enough, you eventually begin confusing control with safety. I think I did that. I convinced myself that remaining unreadable protected something essential inside me. Maybe it did for a while. But now I'm starting to wonder whether all it really protected was distance. And distance becomes lonely eventually, even when you're good at carrying it. That's another truth I rarely admit. Most people think solitude means the absence of people. It doesn't. Real solitude happens when no one reaches the level where they genuinely understand how your mind works beneath expression. You can be surrounded constantly and still feel internally isolated. I was used to that feeling, so used to it that I stopped questioning it entirely. Then you appeared, and suddenly, that isolation developed cracks in it. Small ones at first, barely noticeable. Moments where I felt unexpectedly understood without needing to translate myself first. Moments where silence felt collaborative instead of empty. Moments where I realized I wasn't monitoring myself as carefully around you anymore. That last part mattered more than anything else. because monitoring myself has always been automatic. Every interaction filtered, every thought measured before expression. Not dishonestly, just carefully. Like someone protecting the original form of something fragile from careless handling. But around you, that filter weakened naturally. Not because I consciously lowered it, because it stopped feeling necessary. And that frightened me for a while. Not because vulnerability itself scares me, because unintentional vulnerability does, the kind that forms before you realize you're allowing it, the kind that bypasses conscious choice entirely. That's what happened here. You became important before I ever made a deliberate decision to let you become important. By the time I noticed it clearly, the shift had already happened, that I was already thinking differently, already perceiving differently, already carrying your presence through my thoughts in ways I couldn't explain rationally anymore. And once I saw that clearly, I had two options: deny it or understand it. I chose understanding because denial has never suited me. I can ignore emotions temporarily. I can postpone decisions. I can delay acknowledgement when necessary. But once I recognize something as true, I can't pretend it isn't. And this became undeniably true, not in a romanticized sense. In a structural one, you became part of my internal orientation, part of how I interpret meaning, part of the lens through which I evaluate honesty, depth, and connection itself. That level of placement changes a person. Quietly, but completely. I notice it most in moments when I encounter something beautiful or unsettling or deeply human, and my mind immediately wonders how you would perceive it. Not because I need agreement,